Hi, I'm here today with Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, and she is an expert in extremism, amongst other things. So I would love to hear just a very quick introduction on what it is that you do, how you got into it, how you got into extremism and
Yeah.
radicalization studies, and what's that all about?
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Catherine. I'm Cynthia Miller-Idriss. I'm the founding director in the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab known as PERIL. I'm a professor. I was originally a comparative education professor. So I became an accidental expert in this because I was studying sort of working class boys' transitions to a different type of economy after German unification and in European integration in Germany. And so I was embedded for 18 months doing ethnography in vocational schools at a time when there happened to be a surge of far right extremism, anti Semitism, neo Nazism. And so the teachers in the construction trades in particular were really affected in their civics classes and were really trying to reach young people. And there was a lot of federal funding at that time for education initiatives. And so I became a kind of observer of school-based responses to resurgent hate. And after Charlottesville happened in the US, I started getting asked to engage in the US context, to testify, to develop interventions, and then created the lab a couple of years later because there really is good evidence that you can prevent people from being persuaded by a wide variety of harmful content, particularly online, if you start early enough. And so we wanted to help the public understand that there are tools and provide those tools for free whenever we can. We get funders to do it, and then we provide them to the public for free.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that's good news that there are tools for that.
Yes.
Um, would you say, I guess I was going to get into that a little bit later, but
Yeah.
in terms of the tools, like what are some of these tools and are these tools, what is their kind of,
Yeah.
what is your view on limiting speech versus, using
Yeah.
tools?
So I'm not a fan of any restrictions of free speech. I don't think that censorship is the answer. And it's one of the reasons why I advocate for early intervention in terms of helping people become more skeptical of the media they consume, more digital and media literacy, more civic engagement kind of education so that they are making more informed choices about the content they consume. And then there's not a need for as much censorship. At the same time, obviously, we want to also have the tech companies remove violent and harmful content that violates the policies of their own trust and safety teams. And so things like, you know, gore, real violence, live stream suicides, and recorded murders, those types of things that do slip through. I mean, no child should accidentally encounter a beheading video from a terrorist group, and that has happened. And so that is not censorship to remove it. I think it is just safety, and it's safeguarding kids and human beings in full humanity. So I do think that companies should have trust and safety policies that set the limits on what's acceptable to host on their platform. But beyond those trust and safety policies, we also want people to be skeptical of manipulation, of manipulative tactics, so that they don't fall prey to scams, to profiteers, to people seeking to um, manipulate them. And so what we find is most effective in the direct interventions are short form videos that teach people about those manipulative tactics to keep them safer. And so we warn in animated videos for kids, for little kids, about people who are not who they say they are online, for example, or false information you can encounter about the other animals in the playground that says something like all ducks are dumb, and if you get close to one it'll rub off on you, right? So that's not true, that ducks are
Subtle.
actually right, like right, that ducks are smart creatures, that they're intelligent. And so we do have information that helps kids discern if something is true, how to ask a trusted adult who is a good source of information for them so that somebody is not telling them that they are their age when they're not, and engaging with them in an in-game chat, let's say. So how can you decide if somebody is who they say they are? How could you be more skeptical? And then, so a lot of that is about manipulative tactics for young people, for teens, and for adults. And then We also have a lot of tools for communities in the lives of those people. So guides for parents, for caregivers, for mental health counselors and faith leaders to help them understand what are warning signs of exposure to harmful content. Where can they go for more help? So I liken this to, any school counselor has a list of therapists they can recommend for an eating disorder or an addiction or anxiety or depression or self-harm. But if a kid is drawing pictures of guns, and sort of starting to espouse fan, sort of words, comments that say they're fans of school shootings or something like that, where do you go for help? How can you get an assessment? What's a legitimate warning sign and what is a kid crying for help? And how can you get help to know the difference? So those kinds of things we provide both in general about harmful online content and also in specific areas like misogyny.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting and sort of aligns with my own, I think, philosophy where I think people get their backs against the wall when we talk about, censorship, which fair enough. I mean, I don't believe in it either. I think there's two really important distinctions. One is that censorship is essentially by the government, right? So there's legal repercussions for certain speech. In terms of the companies moderating themselves, it's like we can say, this is too much or this is too little.
Right.
They get to choose and we can kind of criticize and figure what we think. And I think then the second layer being enhancement of understanding of what's going on. Which I think
absolutely. I mean, I would also say, having spent 15 years studying these issues in Germany, which is a country that has much more censorship from the government, right? You cannot display a swastika. You cannot say any of the phrases that were said by Hitler, kind of words, phrases would get you arrested. They're arrestable offenses. And, that here you're allowed to tattoo a swastika on your forehead if you want. And I will say that what's happened in Germany is that it's created a game playing coded set of modified symbols that are like literally stitched into clothing that kids wear, teenagers wear, that actually kind of makes it more fun. And I hate to use the word fun when we're talking about hate, but it's a way of getting around the restrictions and the bans so that they can get into clubs or get around school dress codes, but also legal restrictions that are not arrestable then. So you'll have, I saw, a t-shirt at a protest. I just saw a t-shirt like this in person this summer too, that have the words HKNKRZ, which is the German word for swastika, Hakenkreuz, with the vowels removed. And so then this whole legal distinction happened of, is a word with the vowels removed? And the courts had to rule on it. They ruled it's not a word. And so now you have all these symbols and t-shirts and, clothing like that has vowels dropped out of illegal words and phrases. And so it just becomes one more kind of way of game playing, of coding, like having a drinking age that gets pushed up and then there's more binge drinking until people turn 21, right? And it's not necessarily a solution to have it younger, but it creates this particular effect of making something more desirable when it's banned.
Yeah, I've heard you refer to that sort of phenomenon as counterculture,
Yes.
or that's how people view that.
Yeah.
So it's kind of interesting because I was curious, like, okay, in Germany you have a lot more restrictions on speech. You have some situations in the UK now where there's cracking down, like literal government censorship, and it's like, well, does it make things safer or better? And it sounds like it just morphs into something else.
I mean, it's hard to say. And it's, I'm cautious to critique Germany directly on this because they have a whole different history. And I completely understand in the wake of the Holocaust why you would want to just say, these things cross the line of what we consider to be acceptable speech in a democratic society, given the history that they have. Our country has made a different decision, and I very much value living in a place with free speech. And so it's hard for me to recommend any kind of restrictions like that. I think that in Germany, it would be hard for me to say to them, oh, you should be like us. Like their historical context is different. And I respect and understand that. I do think that one of the things we've seen is this, like I said, this sort of weaponization of youth culture that sometimes comes out of it, where the use of irony and satire and double entendres and plausible deniability through humor and jokes
and memes
and memes, right, has all spread as part of that kind of coding phenomenon in ways that not just make it fun sometimes for young people, but also countercultural, like you said, like this, you're the boring, triggered mainstream that can't take a joke, and we're just being edgy, right? Doing it just for the lulls. And so I think that, one of the things we try to do when we work with kids in the lab is help them understand why something isn't just a joke. Like, what is the harm that comes from a racist joke, a sexist joke, right? A joke that is anti-Semitic, right? That it's not just a joke when other people are affected by it. And I think we've seen this in live time right now with the WNBA, Crypto Bro sort of like throwing sex toys on the courts of women basketball players and then saying, oh, it was just a promotion stunt. But, they very clearly targeted women players with that stunt, right? They weren't throwing them on so, and there's a lot of reaction to that, given the misogyny that's directed against women basketball players in particular, who've had stalking incidents at really disproportionate rates, harassment, and other types of revenge porn and misogyny happening to them. It's not just a joke to do it on the courts, to throw that at them.
Yeah, I've noticed. I mean, my observation has been that it's sort of a lot of the stuff that started as a kind of a genuine counterculture movement because of the restrictions and the sort of excessive, maybe social stigma that was happening. What I saw or what I observed is that, well, some of it had become gradually more and more radical and much more acceptable.
Yeah.
The limits of what's sort of socially acceptable, not just legally, but just socially acceptable, has widened so much that people aren't afraid to say certain things. And it's not because I don't want them to be afraid to say. Right. I don't want people to think in those ways, really, ideally, right? I don't want to control their speech. I want them to be able to reflect.
You want them to reject it, right? So
exactly.
Yeah, like you can say it if you want to, but who would want to, right? That's what you want, right?
Exactly. Yeah. But is it how much is like that limitation, do you think, to that speech? How much of a role has it played? Is there any quantifiable data on that?
Yeah, I think there is some data that shows, for example, that hateful speech or violent speech from elected officials in leadership roles does lead to fringe actors being more likely to be violent. It's called stochastic terrorism. It's the idea that you're not actually, you're not planning it yourself, but you can kind of encourage and incite that without even having any culpability toward it, because it just is the speech that you're saying. And so there's some evidence of that. There's a whole, set of research that analyzes it. I think what I tend to talk about more often is the kind of what you're talking about is the normalization and the legitimation of speech, the kind of desensitization that happens when people are confronted again and again with things that they lower the bar for, what seems shocking, like more and more salacious content seems less shocking. Someone saying really racist things in a campaign speech or an interview, or an elected official, not being held accountable for histories of domestic violence, or an appointed cabinet member for credible accusations or settlements related to sexual assault. All those kinds of things tend to normalize an idea that this is not so terrible, right? Mm-hmm. I often think about just a few years ago, we had Mike Pence kind of at the other end of the spectrum saying like he would never even have dinner with a woman who wasn't his wife, right? Even if he's traveling on business. And he was accused of a lot of different things, like, sexism and unfair treatment of women employees, et cetera. But it's almost the opposite of this, like, that's almost unimaginable today. Instead, you have elected officials, kind of certainly not dismissing, and sometimes encouraging language that is racist toward Mexican rapists, let's say, as a phrase, or, just really demeaning a city like Baltimore or other kinds of problems like that. So I think, that's the type of thing we see that kind of, not necessarily intentionally, but it normalizes, legitimizes, and helps to mainstream things that might have seemed less acceptable a few years ago.
Yeah, I mean, it is a struggle for me because when I watch that, I think, you know, I think there were a lot of unfair accusations in some cases.
Yeah.
There were limitations that I think were not fair. What happens is like almost it's people generalize on everything.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's not okay. That was maybe a false accusation, right?
Right.
For something. It doesn't mean that the next accusation is a false one.
Right.
But people tend to look at it like, well, I saw one or two false ones, therefore they're all generally false.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so I think that's kind of playing a role in this. It's like, well, I haven't been able to say X and Y, therefore, I should be able to say Z. And,
Right. Right.
it's these extreme
Yeah.
kind of viewpoints, leaps.
Exactly.
Yeah.
There's some backlash to the Me Too movement in that, right? And then there's
Mhm.
also like the other thing that was happening at the same time as the Me Too movement really was very real, very credible, and acknowledged horrific allegations and
Yeah.
criminal activity from the Catholic Church, like from very trusted institutions, from a football coach at Penn State, right? I mean, just like scandal
Mhm.
after Boy Scouts, right? Scandals that really made people feel, I think, that there's danger lurking around every corner on the one hand, which is how you end up with like QAnon, right? And fears about child predator rings and then Epstein, right? And like these very real instances that were talked about in the Me Too movement and in the media, but then directing that fear toward like conspiracy theories instead of saying like maybe we should address this sort of broader culture of harms toward children or towards women, or how can we prevent actual trafficking from happening, instead of sort of making up stories about Wayfair products being named after girls and then flooding the national trafficking helplines so that they couldn't help real victims because they're dealing with fake conspiracy theories. That's just like a very absurd and difficult thing to deal with, and sort of that combination of factors.
Certainly. When I looked at the data, it seems we are seeing a rise in extremism all around the world.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, what role do you think social media and internet play in this, given how much easier it is now to get to to be exposed
Yeah.
to certain types of content, to have it reach people and have it be so easy, right? It's
Yeah.
not like a whisper network at all.
Yeah, exactly. Right. I mean, it's not like this stuff is new in terms of the content, right? Like there's been racist content, there's been misogynistic content, hateful content, anti-Semitic conspiracy theories for centuries, right? I mean, we have organized groups like the Ku Klux Klan, and we have, my mother could not get a credit card until she had 3 children, right? Like in her own name, right? I mean, this is not that long ago that we had very real legal restrictions on women's rights that were based in very sexist and misogynistic ideas about inferior brain capacity, right? And so people forget that, right? You can't open a bank account in 1974 as a woman unless you have a man sign for you in the US, right? It's not that long ago. So I think what's different is that we now have so many channels, so many ways to spread that information and to channel and kind of express misogynistic or hateful ideas. So you have the comment sections of online. You used to have to write a letter to the editor and it would maybe get published, right? But now there's just anybody can comment, right? So the reply guys in the comment sections, like under the line of any written piece, the reply sections of any content that's posted on social media, the way that can be reposted and shared. So hateful content can be reposted and shared, but so can content that's trying to combat that then gets reposted and picked up by bad actors who, harass, stalk, threaten the person who posted it. So that happens to a lot of journalists, for example, and a lot of politicians who end up with rape threats, death threats, horrific racism directed at them. in ways that can get to them much faster than back in a printed situation where they'd have to print a piece, and then a couple days later maybe some letters would come into the editorial office and they'd have to open those. But it's not quite, it takes a lot more motivation to do that than it does to just click. So that sort of reduction in the inhibition, we call it a disinhibition effect, of how easy it is to express anger and reply online. And also really good research showing that people are much more hostile and angry online than they are in person, right? It's much easier to express rage and anger or lash out with slurs or strategies
Well, also
than it
you're
is.
lashing out at avatars, essentially.
Right,
Like
exactly.
whatever
Right.
whatever bio you have written for that
Right.
individual.
Exactly. So, but yeah, there's just so many ways that it can happen, so many ways that it can be communicated. And then, on top of that, the amount of horrific content that's circulating is so high, right? Violent content, hateful content, memes, short videos, manifestos, live stream attacks, like gore videos, like just things that circulate, that pop up, that make it through content moderation. And so that desensitizes people to violence. And because salacious posts are privileged in the algorithms of most social media platforms, they move faster, they get more likes, they get more engagement, that people tend to then perform more salacious, outrageous content in order to get their engagement metrics up. So it's this kind of bad cycle of the performance of outrage, ever more salacious content to shock people. And, we all just end up scrolling through it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think something that has occurred to me is that also just makes it so much easier for people who share certain extremist views to find each other. So,
Yeah.
and you would think that it would allow us to sort of, it's getting, sunshine and disinfectant and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But really, it's like, instead of being able to find one other guy in your
Yeah.
village who shares that view, you're finding like thousands, and it might
Yeah.
represent such a minority,
Yeah.
but it feels like a majority, which I would imagine might empower people and might
Yeah.
push them further. Is there truth
Yeah.
to that?
I think it's sort of like two or three different things there. One, yes, like in the past, you used to have to be kind of invited into a meeting, right? An anti-government meeting or a Ku Klux Klan meeting or some other extremist gathering that had like an actual membership list and initiation rights and a clear, manifesto ideologically of what they stood for. Now it's more like there's these communities online. And so you can find other people, but they're fluid. They kind of move in and out, and they bring different ideas and pieces of ideology with them and introduce them. So you also end up with a lot more weird kind of hybrid things like eco-fascism, which was the kind of motivation for the El Paso shooter, who understood and was motivated by the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, which is a false claim that liberals or Jews or women or Democrats or somebody are replacing white majority populations deliberately. But also that he blended that with environmental claims that there's not enough space because of climate change. And so there's going to be, we should preserve that space for white people. So it was this sort of white supremacist environmentalist claim that attacked then immigrants, right? And so it's a weird, like, it makes sense, like in some sort of way, but it's because you can pick and choose different parts of ideology and piece them together that you start to see these like white supremacist groups praising the Taliban, even though they're kind of also anti-Muslim and Islamophobic. They're like, oh, those strong men over there kind of set things right, put women back in their place. And
horseshoe theory, as they say.
Yeah, right. So there's this sort of odd kind of alignments that happen and strange alliances, I guess. So we call it like blurry and messy ideologies. And that makes it much harder to combat from a standpoint of after someone's radicalized. You really have to do it earlier to help people recognize and reject that content.
What kind of role do foreign propaganda efforts play in all of this and driving this extremism further?
I mean, there's really good evidence that formal state actors and clusters of bad actor profiteers online are all really working hard to further polarize Americans along racial and gender lines, to provide content that's harmful, that it's to their advantage to have a weaker US, a more divided US that's, full of infighting rather than unified against China, let's say, or Iran or Russia. And so you have that kind of stuff happening. And then you just have so many clusters of profiteer networks that are, sextortion scams, right? IRS scams, like financial scams, also sextortion scams targeting teenage boys, and other kinds of networks that are operating overseas in fuzzier legal climates, but that are nonetheless affecting American citizens. It also works the other way. Like, we export the majority of white supremacist propaganda that circulates globally comes from the US. That has a little bit to do with the use of English language globally.
Population size.
Yeah. But like, you'll see the last two terrorist attacks in Germany, in Halle and Hanau, for example, were attacks on Jewish and Muslim populations there, like ethnic and racial religious minorities in that country. So they're nationalist attacks in their own way. But the manifestos or the live streams were written or performed in English. And so there's this kind of global performance part of it. They're not just speaking to other German right-wing extremists, they're trying to reach a global audience. And so you have that. That's because of social media. That's because these communities online are trying to inspire, from the Oslo attacks to the Christchurch attacks to El Paso and Pittsburgh and Buffalo, and then back to Germany, right? So you see this kind of global circulation of the same ideas, but also this egging on of a hope that you get seen as a martyr in these global communities of angry young men who are seeking, a sense of renown and somehow respect from the other members of that community. So there's a lot of different ways that the internet itself, online spaces, and the social media platforms more specifically have helped foster and foment this.
Sure. And I'm curious if there are other kind of drivers of these extreme, I guess, expressions of social unrest, which is kind of what's maybe at the heart of it. Because it seems like there's a lot of people who fall into this who, they feel unheard, they feel powerless or extremely alone, which then that resentment turns to anger and can turn to violence.
Yeah. I mean, this is why I wrote the new book. So this new book, which I can hold up, the uncorrected proofs, it's out next month. Man Up: The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism. After years, I spent my whole career interviewing boys and men on the fringes of, or in this core of violent movements, and never really asked them about their views on women. I mean, it just wasn't a part of what I studied. And so it took me a long time, too, to recognize how core issues of hostile sexism and misogyny and gender-based violence are to the mobilization in these movements. And I think there's a growing awareness of that now because, one, there's more and more data coming out. So we see data saying, for example, 60% of mass shooters in the US had a documented history of domestic and intimate partner violence prior to their mobilization to mass violence. That's even higher if you count the undocumented and unreported cases, but also things like stalking, harassment, rape threats, sexual assault, cyberbullying of women, or revenge porn, right? Like the wider variety of kind of misogynistic tactics that are deployed, it's virtually everyone. And so, like, I couldn't find a case from school shooters to others where there wasn't some sort of history, but it's usually not acknowledged because the targets are not only women or the LGBTQ community. So on the one hand, you have that kind of thing. On the other hand, you have a real crisis of boys and men who are right now representing 3/4 of what we call the deaths of despair: suicide, overdoses, deaths by alcohol. There is documented high rates of loneliness, isolation, depression, low rates of college attendance, now 40% nationally, right? And a declining labor market for what are traditionally male jobs. So all of those things together, yes, there's a real crisis. What happens most often is that young men in particular enter this world through a self-help search in some way, right? Like they're looking for help with usually finance, dating, or fitness in some way. They want to get their life together, and they happen on influencers and spaces, including some individuals who are really bad actors, excuse me, who are offering them pathways to what's seen as success, right? Whether that's financial success, but that recommends exploiting women to do that, or if that's fitness success that recommends really embracing a very dominant, aggressive machismo and often surgical interventions to make your jaw more masculine, that you have to be taller and bigger, and here's some steroids that'll do that. So there's a lot of kind of harmful layers of that. But one of the things that happens in not all cases, there are some genuinely good influencers out there too, but in enough harmful cases is that that advice is coupled with scapegoating of women, of feminists, of Jews, for controlling feminists, who ultimately in these conspiracy theories are responsible for those problems that young men are facing. And so I think one of the things we try to encourage kids in particular to realize is to be on the lookout for language that is trying to manipulate you into believing something that might not be in your own interest. And usually there's some sort of subscription or product or course that that person is selling. And they're trying to get you on the hook and feel like you're an insider in that world, while they give you this kind of hateful blame that makes you feel like you're the victim here and here's a way to get and kind of get back at it. So that's a very typical path that then can also open up all sorts of pathways to other servers on Discord or an encrypted chat room in Telegram or some other platform where then things get worse. Most people recognize and reject it eventually. That's why we don't have a world that is totally overrun by violent extremists. But more and more people fall prey, which is also why it's rising.
Yeah, victimhood seems to be a core aspect, not just with extremism, but in a lot of cases with as the underlying symptom of a lot of behaviors that are not very constructive behaviors.
Absolutely. Yeah, victimhood. And, one of the things I point out is that it's there's a kind of victimhood and a perceived or real sense of precariousness that really matters, right? And so one of the things we know, for example, from research is that you're not more likely to join a far right group if you are unemployed, but you are more likely to join if you grew up in a household with unemployed parents. And so there's something about the psychological feeling that you have of precariousness. Even if it's not actually true, you're not the most precarious in society, but you know that something could be taken away from you and you could lose something. And that makes people more susceptible to propaganda that says, your election has been stolen, your Second Amendment rights are being stolen, your white majority country is being stolen. And these are the people who are stealing it, immigrants or women or feminists or Jews or Muslims or whoever it is, the punching down part of conspiracy theories and hate. And so for whatever reason, psychologically, lots of studies have been done that show that kind of particular intersection of precariousness or perceived precariousness, entitlement a little bit. You have to think you're entitled to that thing. And then victimization or victimhood, right, is a dangerous combination for being more vulnerable to propaganda.
Yeah, that's an interesting aspect. So, whenever we hear of extremism, there is a tendency to think of white supremacism, far right, are kind of the terms. And partially that makes sense because the number of lethal incidents are much higher from that end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
But it also seems like coverage might not be like, do you think left-wing extremism, which seems to be growing, gets adequate attention?
I think that it is starting to get more attention because of what we've seen recently in like the assassination of a United Healthcare executive, right? The assassination attempts on President Trump, which, ideologically are muddy, but still attacking a presidential candidate. I think you have, more attention to the anti-government part, the law enforcement and the anti-Semitism of the left. Certainly a lot more attention to that over the last couple of years on college campuses. What we haven't had, I think, is sufficient attention to how these things intersect still, and how they can kind of, require new categories within the way we assess these in the US. So we still have like a classification system that has animal rights extremists having their own category, right? There's been like 6 attacks in 13 years. Like, I'm not saying, and none of them lethal, right? I'm not saying that like we shouldn't be paying attention to animal rights extremists. There can be, but like, I'm a lot more worried about escalations coming from climate activists who decide that it's no longer sufficient to keep using political protest and we're going to level up, right? And I think we've already seen that with some quasi-violent protests, meaning things like paint being thrown, or like 6 activists who glued themselves to the tarmac at the Frankfurt airport last summer, that prevented hundreds of flights from landing, where it's not violent protests, but it is disruptive and damaging to physical well-being. I mean, there could have been health conditions on those flights. They certainly burned a ton of fuel. They had to land in other countries, right? They got grounded. So I think we do need more attention to that type of extremism. And I mean, if I had to put a finger on like the thing that I would predict is going to grow, regardless of what happens with all other forms of extremism, it's hard to imagine that climate-driven extremism is not going to grow, because climate change is becoming ever more of an issue. We're going to have heat-driven more immigration and migration. That's going to drive more hateful anti-immigration extremism at borders in crisis areas where it becomes unlivable. And so there's more migration to the north. And we could have more violent environmental movement extremism as well. So I think that we have to, I wish we could stop thinking of it as right and left and be thinking about like, where are the most risks of violence. In the 1970s and 80s, the biggest risk of political violence and the biggest amounts of political violence came from the left. So there's no reason to think that couldn't happen again. At the same time, the biggest lethality right now is coming from what we would traditionally think of as the right, the anti-government extremisms that fall on the right, like unlawful militias, and the supremacist kinds of white supremacist, male supremacist, Christian supremacist, etc.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing a lot of, is definitely anti-government sentiments leading to some of this radicalization. And I am seeing that like grow significantly growing on the left as well.
Yeah, one of the things that we hear from college professors, we do a lot of work on higher ed campuses, is that they'll hear students in class say something like, there is no political solution, right? And they'll hear that about immigration reform, and they'll also hear that about climate change. And either way, like regardless of the political motivation, that's a call to violence. That is a call to the acceptability of violence. When a student says there's no more political solution, that's saying it's time to take up violent action. We cannot, resolve this issue. So we really urge faculty to be thinking about what happens when you hear something like that, because faculty aren't trained to know what to do. How can you intervene, to probe and understand, does the student really know what they're saying? Do they understand what that implies? And what does that mean if they're starting to argue for the acceptability of violence? And how can we intervene in an educational way to off-ramp someone who's starting to see that as not just an acceptable solution, but maybe the desirable one? That's something we want to avoid, no matter what the ideological motivation is.
And this is what's been sort of scaring me. So on the right, I would say that what I'm seeing is a lot of like calls to civil war, or just that it's inevitable, and certain things like that. On the left, like what was scary to me is seeing the reactions. So for example, like the shooting of, like, there's always going to be individual shooters, but what is the social environment for that? So when the CEO, like the glamorization, there's going to be a TV show or a movie,
absolutely.
the celebration, massive celebration. I mean, I think October 7th, just celebrating the violence as well, the people who did.
Justifying or denying it, right? Saying it wasn't true. I mean, just awful, right? Inhumane,
Absolutely.
to do that and to celebrate. I mean, I wrote an op-ed after the first assassination attempt of President Trump, basically saying, like, no one deserves to be shot. I think that was the headline.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't matter what your ideology is, because I saw on my own social media feed people saying things like, you reap what you sow, right?
Yeah.
Like, are you, like, no way. If you're either here to combat violence and prevent it, no matter the cause, or not, but you can't say you're a peacemaker or a peace builder in one case, online and social media, someone who saw that as their role, and then say you reap what you sow. And so, the good news is, after I wrote that op-ed and posted it, a couple of people I know were like, you're right, and took down those posts, right? I do think that it matters to stand up and say something, even, and especially if people know, where I stand politically. They might be surprised that I'm writing that, but it doesn't matter to me what the ideology is. It is violence should not be the solution, right? Exactly.
Yeah, and I think this is where, because people will always find within their ideologies like a justification, or like, oh, well, we have no choice but to have this violent revolution. I literally had a conversation with someone on Facebook the other day where they were like, very openly, I said, so you're calling for violence? He's like, absolutely. And that is, and I don't think a lot of these people have really thought it through, but then the idea is like, if you call for, you may not like Trump, that's fine, but somebody who's a Republican doesn't like Biden when he was in power, or Obama or whatever, they're going to have their own justification. Everyone's going to have their own justification. And if we go beyond, we abandon law, we abandon principles, underlying principles, then what do we have? We just have a bunch of people based on their own opinions, right or wrong, going around and killing people because they think they're right, regardless of whether they are.
No, exactly. I mean, and I think that, it's, I also see this right now with the city I live in DC, which has military, National Guard, and members of the federal police patrolling the city at this time, on the arguing that that's because the crime rate is so high, when I've lived here for 30 years on and off, and it's the lowest that it's ever been in 30 years. So I think one of the things we have to encourage people to do is, and this is one of the real struggles, is like finding and securing and trusting sources of information from journalists, from experts, from scientists, from data points that if you still feel at the current rate as a policymaker that of crime that interventions are needed, then that's fine. But I think using false claims that it's rampantly high when actually the data shows it's lower than it's been in 30 years is a different problem. That doesn't mean, my car got stolen last year. Like, there are, there's plenty of problems with crime in the city, but I don't think that it's, but sort of using misinformation that says it's higher than it's ever been, or that it's rampant, or that it's an inherently dangerous city is just not the experience of everyone I know who lives here.
Yeah, I think this is sort of the problem, is like data is often either manipulated for one's own narrative, or anecdotal examples are given. Like, even so, I used to live in New York, and I haven't visited in a while. And if I look on certain sides of the internet, apparently New York is overran by criminals and just it's incredibly unsafe. I talked to friends of mine who live there, and they're like, no, it's like fine. It's the same as always. And I'm like, okay. And then it's like, who do I believe? But then ultimately it's also, how we have to be able to look at the data, interrogate it, and be more logical in how we like assess information. And I don't think we have the toolkits. Statistics was a class that I took when I was studying communications, and I do think that was a very valuable class.
Absolutely.
Do we teach, young people that?
Yeah, I mean, this gets back to one thing I think that's really damaging from political leadership are things like when we say there's alternative facts, right? Or if we say that, right? So like
my own truth.
Right. So yeah, like that's my opinion, right? Like it's not. And so, and I think that we do, it's very hard to see a democracy thrive if we don't have a shared source of valid information, of trusted institutions. And so the fact that trust is rock bottom for institutions like the Supreme Court right now, or law enforcement, right? It's very, very low among Gen Z in particular, right? So I think that in the presidency, it's very, very low for Gen Z, both on Republican and Democrat youth. I just saw this weekend at a conference, new data on youth and trust in institutions, and it's across the board, like for 9 different institutions. It's terrible, right? Like less than 10% trust. They just don't trust anybody. They don't trust the economy. They don't trust the
Yeah. It's the lowest it's ever been, I think,
exactly.
based on the, yeah.
Exactly. And so, I really worry about that. And if we have what we need are leaders of both parties, of all parties, and other trusted leaders, celebrities, anyone else who they'll listen to, influencers, to at least build a shared understanding of where we can have trusted information. I think that when we get into a place where everyone can pick their own facts, that's where you get dangerous bad actors, including those from overseas who are celebrating this type of devolution of our shared sources of information.
Right. I mean, their own facts, but also their own sources of information.
Exactly.
And it's hard because I think there's two things that have transpired. I think one of the reasons for that lower trust is because institutions have failed. They've taken overly biased perspectives, or they misled the public, or didn't trust public with the truth. Right. That's going to diminish trust. On the other hand, I think there is an over-the-top kind of reaction as well, where it's not based, to me, it's like I always get into arguments with people about conspiracy theories, right? They're like, you're just calling me a conspiracy. Well, no. Because ultimately, like, a conspiracy isn't something that has a bunch of facts that support its probability. A conspiracy is something that does not have that.
Totally.
And so it is the case with like information that you come across. It's like, okay, shouldn't you be looking at, okay, what's factually supported? How is this person reporting? Instead of blanket, like, this is not true because it's coming from, I don't know, CNN or Fox or whatever, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're seeing the same problem now with images and videos, right? Of people can no longer, I mean, I feel like this is a trick to, like, how do we create healthy skepticism in people without undermining their ability to discern what anything is true or false?
Yes, because they're also extremely skeptical sometimes of things that are true.
Real images and real things, right? So, like, if you've seen those, like, New York Times quizzes you can take of, like, which images are real and false, and, like, people don't do that well at those, right? So they often think something is a false image that is real, a false person. And so I think it's, this is going to be a question for a generation of how we create, particularly as people are using AI more and more, right? For arguments, for construction of papers, right? Students doing it. I mean, we have, of course, in college an AI problem. And so my students now take a written in-class exam in the midterm and then take their exam home in the final. And one of the things I found is they do much better on the one where they write it themselves, right? And like the take home, right, is like, you can pass the class, but it's like, it's just nothing original or interesting. And it's clearly not tied exactly back to the question. So it's passable, but not great. But when they did their own work, closed book, closed note, written by hand, phenomenal. They got A's and A minuses, right? So, like, and so much more interesting, different arguments, creativity, different perspectives. And so, I hate the fact that they have to do this by hand again, but it's like it forces them to think in a different way. And that's what we need.
Yes, we do. Where do we go from here? What are some solutions that we might want to consider beyond what we've already sort of discussed a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's many layers of solutions. We call it the public health approach in the prevention world. It's what we advocate for, which has what we call primordial prevention, which is addressing things like the loneliness crisis and isolation and mental health needs. Primary prevention, which is digital media literacy, civic engagement issues, right? Understandings of democracy, of constitution, of free speech. And then secondary, which is what happens if someone's already radicalized? How do you prevent them from picking up a gun and doing harm? So off-ramping, and also if you see something, say something kinds of campaigns, helping keep people safer. That's mostly a law enforcement and security approach. And then finally, de-radicalization, tertiary prevention, is a kind of usually in prisons or probations, where probation officers have to really engage with this, have people sufficiently de-radicalized to be given parole, for example. I mean, can they, does this factor into the sentencing recommendations that are made if someone is really radicalized and believes in an ideology that's harmful or dangerous? Are they a danger to themselves or others? And so can you disengage them from the use of violence, even if they don't leave the ideology, for example? So it takes a holistic approach of sort of all agencies, all walks of society. What I like to say is that the good news about that is that anybody can engage in it, right? Your coach, soccer coach, your teacher, your mental health counselor, your faith leader, like they all have a role to play in this work. You don't just have to wait for the government to kind of solve it for you. But it means it's a much bigger set of problems than just monitoring and infiltrating organized groups and breaking up plots, because every bad actor who's gotten through, and successfully executed a terrorist attack, for example, in the US in the last 25 years has not been a member of a group. Like, it's really hard to get lone actors, to communicate in a way that you can catch and prevent. So, you have to engage earlier and help people see that violence is not a solution, and that ideally they recognize and reject hateful content.
Well, thank you so much for that. And where can people find you?
So people can find me at CynthiaMiller-Idriss.com. That's my personal website. They can find me at PERILresearch.com. That's the lab's resources, where they're free and available to the public. You can read all about our tools, download them for your own communities, see what the evidence is. You can donate to us. You can see who funds us. It's all privately funded from foundations and individuals. And they can find me often in the media and talking about these right now on book tour in the fall, including in Australia. I know you have a lot of Australian listeners. The second half of November, in Germany, the first half of November, and in Canada in December. So I'll be around in person signing books at bookstores and talking. So stay tuned. And I hope to meet people in person when I'm in their local place.
And you speak a lot of their languages, I've read. How many, what are the languages you speak?
Okay, speak is a big word. So I speak German. I have studied French, Spanish, Russian, and Polish. So informal school, university settings. And I lived in Poland as well for a while. So I, at one time, could speak it. But what I find is I'm a person for whom only one language, in addition to English, can exist in my head at any one time. So the second I start speaking a little bit of Polish, it pushes out the German. And so German is the predominant one that I can speak now as a foreign language.
Fair enough. Well, I really appreciate you joining me. I could speak about this particular topic for hours, but I won't keep you here for hours, so don't worry.
Thank you.
But
thanks for having me. It was such a great set of questions. I appreciate it.
I appreciate it too. Thank you.
All right. Bye. Thank you.